Hard to believe that it's been 20 years since these films were taken. The hardest part to believe is the fact that I took these films. These films were taken 4 years before most of you were even born. The one thing about South Vietnam that maybe has dimmed in our memories, it never should have, it was not just a place to go, not just a war, but to many it was a home. What you're looking at right now is the housing right off the base at Nha Trang in South Vietnam in 1967. Around the fall, and in those places lived the families. Behind the barbed wire, the faces of the little children. Many of us, of course, had children back in the States. Some evenings we sit out and watch these children play for hours. They're not much different than any other children. Many nights we'd take staples, toothpaste, oatmeal, and things of this nature and give them to the mamas. To make sure that we didn't think they were giving it to the black market, they'd bring the food out and show us as they fed it to their children. While it reinforced us, made us feel real good, but it also assured the fact that they'd get more. This family in particular was very special to me. They lived right behind us on the south side of Nha Trang on the Air Force Base. One evening, as we slept in Quonset huts within 100 feet of this fence, the North Vietnamese came through, took the men that were old enough to go fight for them and abducted them, beat the women and the children, burnt several of the hutches down. Left basically just the women around to try and fend for themselves. It gave us an opportunity to give even more. As you can see in this picture, you can take a look between the huts. You can see where there were some huts and they were burnt down because these cardboard and scrap wood and pieces of sheet metal that we'd sneak through the fence to them at times were the only shelter they had. They liked living right next to the base because it gave them the security they felt like they needed. Again, the children were special. These children will all now be somewhere around 23, 22, 24 years old. Sometimes you have to sit back and reflect and wonder just what they're doing. Again, South Vietnam was just not a war, but it was home to millions of people. Very industrious type people. They made the best of what they could and did what they could to assure the future of their children. From these simple huts, the life that we led right across the fence must have seemed like paradise to them. They worked hard. They were very diligent workers. And it's a part of my life and a memory that I keep. The atrocities, the horrors, and everything else that happened. There were always the good times. But the war itself was quite devastating, as you'll see. It's very difficult to believe that it's been 20 years since these films were taken. Even more difficult to believe that I took these films 20 years ago. The year was 1967. What you're looking at is an area right off Nha Trang Air Force Base in South Vietnam. It was the fall of the year. The fall of the year in South Vietnam, of course, is quite warm. Inside of those areas where the people tried to live were crude, if you will, living quarters, and within those quarters and beyond the barbed wire of our base were the children. I guess really the children were the most special. Our children were thousands of miles away, but foremost in our minds at that time, our children, our wives, our families, our friends. One particular night, our Quonset hut was within a couple hundred feet of this fence. If you look off between the two large radio masts, you can see a guard tower. One evening as we lay asleep, about 1 o'clock in the morning, the North Vietnamese came through. The opening in the living quarters you see there is one of the buildings where the men put up more of a fight than I guess the North Vietnamese figured they would. Those men were killed. Many of the young men that were old enough to fight for the North Vietnamese were abducted, the women beaten, the children beaten. Most of their staples and groceries and things were stolen. It was a way of life to sit back now or even then and say it was right or wrong, and who was right and who was wrong seems somewhat insignificant. Like I say, the children were special to us. We'd go to the commissary or the BX and buy things like toothpaste and soap, oatmeal, powdered milk, things these people certainly couldn't afford, and we would give it to them. The mothers, to make sure we understood that this gift that we were giving them was being used and not sold on the black market or traded, would have the children come out and let us see them brushing their teeth. They'd bathe the little ones where we could view what was going on and make sure the soap was being used. And they'd wash their clothes in buckets out where we could see them using the soap for that. There were times we'd hand them candy in one hand or toothpaste or something they needed in the other. They were pretty clever. They wouldn't take the candy. I guess they knew once they started taking the candy, maybe we'd stop. After the men were taken, it basically left the women to fend for themselves. It was really all they could do just to maintain life. And I guess really in our own way it was kind of a selfish thing in what we gave, because it fed a need in us to feel that we were doing some good for the people. It's hard to think back now and look at the houses they lived in. A lot of the pieces of aluminum and steel that you see there in the wood, we would get from supply or some of the surplus materials and take them over there and sneak them through the fence to allow them to build what they could to protect themselves from the environment. I imagine our Quonset huts that we thought were quite primitive and quite uncomfortable must have looked like mansions to them. Again, there were the children. You have to really think for a minute. These children now are in their mid-20s. You have to think back and wonder where they are and what they're doing. Were they some of the boat people? Or are they still over there fending for themselves, trying to make a living out of what they can? We of course hope that all those children survived. But one by one we left. And behind us the memories, the children of a people and of a country. You can argue ideology as long as you'd like. There were many of us that felt we had a need to be there. We deeply wanted to try and spare these children the suffering that their ancestors had gone through for hundreds of years in this fight and this civil war that had been going on. And that we have to admit that we failed. And we came home to face that failure, whether it was our fault or the politicians. But the memories are there of a people, of a culture, of their perseverance, their hard work, and even their smiles in this time. There are memories of Vietnam that I hold back many times that I don't share with anybody. But there are also fond memories. And you'll see a little bit of both as we proceed. Well, it's kind of like Welcome to Vietnam. From airplanes that served during World War II, like the old Beech C-45s, to the newer airplanes, like the one that carried me into South Vietnam for the first time, the old 123s, and the newer and the more powerful Hercules C-130s, which you'll see in a little while. It's one of the old 123s here. These pictures are taken at Da Nang Air Force Base. I was actually stationed in Thailand, but on 2 occasions we volunteered to go into South Vietnam I guess for 2 reasons. One, to help out during our monsoon season. There was a heavy offensive type times in South Vietnam, and 2, being stationed in Thailand kind of left a curiosity in you. You think back, you remember the friends, Lloyd, Armstrong, Jones. 2 of us decided to kind of add a little excitement to our life. We'd volunteer and we'd go to a place called Khe Sanh. Now, if you don't know your geography real well, if you remember South Vietnam, it was on the Pacific coast. Its east coast was on the Pacific Ocean. Khe Sanh was a small marine outpost that was the northwest outpost of South Vietnam itself. We were about 8 miles from the demilitarized zone of between South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and about 8 miles from Laos. Kind of a hot corner. We spent a few days at Da Nang watching the F-105s like you see right here, and the F-4Cs, and what we call our fighter bombers take off. Even though you got to put up with the noise of the projector, you're lucky you didn't have to put up with the noise of those big J79 4-stage afterburners that were going off. They make more noise than 10 747s. We took off out of Da Nang Odyssey 123 like you see here, and first of all went over to Dong Ha. Spent a couple of days at Dong Ha, then we're lifted out to go on into Khe Sanh. The old Chinook helicopters. We had a tremendous arsenal over there. We had a lot of different type aircraft. A lot of men. This is a Quonset hut at Dong Ha that was hit. It was basically an Air Force installation at this point. The hit was so fast and so devastating. 3 of the men weren't even able to scramble out the small doors at the base of the building that get into the bunkers below. These were destroyed by rockets. Not heavy bombs, not the 250s or the 500 or 1,000-pound bombs. Just small rockets. Very effective. Doesn't leave much. These guys keep an outlook. Dong Ha was within sight of the DMZ. We could look out and see an outpost called Con Tien in the DMZ itself. And it was quite often that Dong Ha would get hit. We took some heavy artillery and mortar and rocket attacks while we were there. You get in your bunker, you keep your head down, and you wait till it's over. That's all you can do. That's the remains of a fighter that made it back this far, and that's as far as he got. They pulled airstrikes on the area. This is up at Khe Sanh now, and if you look real hard, you'll see the flash sometimes. I'm using a pretty good sized lens without a tripod, so sometimes you can't see it, but what you'll see sometimes is the napalm go off inside. The airstrikes were called in because we were picking up small rounds and some mortar rounds on the base. If you look real hard sometimes you'll see the silver canisters going to the ground. The white clouds were normally what we called Billy Pete, white phosphorus. Then we had the gunships. Puff the Magic Dragon with the General Electric Gatling guns. You won't see him firing here, but when he set his wingtip up and started orbiting, from that altitude he could put a bullet every square inch. Very little survived. Here you see fighters coming in, marking their targets, and coming back and dropping the canisters. You can see it this time, and you'll see it explode. This one over the horizon. I think in a minute you'll see one that tumbles in, and you'll just see the explosion within the grass itself and this underbrush. That's very dense forest over there. A few miles away, so you really never know if they're hitting anything or just shaking the dust off the trees and giving the snakes a nervous breakdown. We lived in these bunkers. There were 3 of these bunkers at Khe Sanh. They were occupied by the Air Force personnel. The enlisted people in one, the officers in the next one, and then intel in the next one. On a few occasions we'd fly back into Da Nang. It was basically, the city was on the coast. Go by some of the Air America, these were basically CIA aircraft that flew the areas. Sometimes it's kind of hard to hold the camera steady, but there's a lot of shipping, a lot of supplies being brought in and out. Major seaports that were put up overnight. As you look at these films, it's not too much different than flying off the Southern California peninsulas and down around the Bajas, the Blue Pacific. And then you go over the land, you see the reality of the war, where the B-52s have come through. And they've left the land looking like the craters of the moon. And right beside the areas that are devastated are the farmlands where they grow their rice and try and feed their people. The cities, the rivers coming in, the sand pans that gather around the mouth of the rivers, the bridges, and then again the pox area of the land. These craters are generated by 500-pound bombs to 1,000-pound bombs. Now that's nothing more than a white phosphorus rocket that's been sent in probably by a forward air controller to mark a target. We were in the process of flying from Da Nang back into Khe Sanh, so we didn't stick around to see what was going on. There were hills, terrain. Not much different right now looking down on this and when we fly over the upper deserts of California. An O1E forward air controller. That one has to be an Army bird. We maintain 4 Air Force O1Es at Khe Sanh. Those aircraft were used basically they're small, 2-place. There's one right there by our old shack. Our pilots would go up, we called them FACs, which was forward air controllers. And they'd try and monitor and supervise battles going on in the field and call in air support And on numerous occasions they would orbit those areas where the Marines were pinned down or the Army troops were pinned down, drawing heavy fire. Drawing fire themselves, they call the fighters and the helicopters in to get the men out. They saved countless lives. They were eyes that were very, very necessary to our ground troops. And despite all the stories you may hear and all the inter-service rhetoric, believe me, the Marines and the Army boys both really appreciated the fact that some of those pilots would stay up there even giving their lives to maintain some kind of vigilance over them, to try and help them get out of the predicaments they wish they weren't in. That was a napalm canister coming in. As you can see, it's pretty close to the base. The napalm burns black. You'll see the big silver canisters come off, tumble in and explode. Some of them explode deep in the jungle to the point that all you can see were the shock waves, and later you see the smoke come filtering out of the jungle. There's an example. All you see is the flash. And inside of there is the jelly type napalm. It sticks to whatever it hits and it just burns away. I had the opportunity on a couple occasions to fly out on some of the forward air control aircraft. This is a Marine C-130 coming in with supplies. This was a hit a little bit closer to the base than we kind of liked.